All right. Welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I am here with Matt Stauffer, and I feel like this is another one of those ones where I feel like I have a running bit. I can't imagine that anyone who's listening to this podcast doesn't know who you are, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself anyway?
I would glad to, but first I got to say you are a man after my own heart because I work so hard with every podcast I ever make to have a good funk. I want an intro that kind of gets me going. And so when you have that play, every time I'm like, oh no, we're gonna have a good conversation. I like this. Hi, I'm Matt Stauffer. I am the CEO and founder of Titan, which is a consultancy working primarily in Laravel. We help people build and rescue the web apps and then build and rescue the development teams that they work with. I run the Laravel podcast in the business of Laravel podcast. I wrote Laravel Up and Running, speak at conferences, and try to help the internet be a nicer place.
And I can attest to the fact that you certainly do that.
Oh, I appreciate it.
When we started talking about doing a show, the idea that I pitched you that at the time felt a little bit too small, but still funny, was you and I have both independently essentially developed a whole linting setup to enforce our own personal programming preferences upon our entire teams.
Yep.
And I think, tlint is like that. That's where that came from, was just like, I want to stop having these conversations. And
yeah, there's more than that though, but yes.
Sure. Yeah. We'll get into the backstory.
Yeah, there's so many backstories.
And laralint is the same thing. It's just like, I actually have contributed a couple things to tlint, and then for some reason there were enough changes that I was just like, screw it, I'm just going to build my own thing.
Nice.
And so I have my own basic version of that, and it's all sorts of different things. It's just enforcing, do you use facades? Do you use global helpers?
Right.
That the sort of like, it doesn't really matter. There are 15 different ways to do things, but let's pick one and be consistent.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I just think, especially in like sort of the context of over engineering, there is just something very amusing about that whole approach to
yeah. What am I going to spend my time with? Making everybody else code like me.
Yes. But in thinking about it, I think there's a lot more to it. And so I thought we will take that as a jumping off point around a larger conversation. So I don't know. I'd love to hear a little bit of the backstory of, how did your approach to this start?
So when we first started Titan, there was two of us, and my business partner was like, hey, I'm nearing 40. I'm tired of coding. And I was like, hey, I'm tired of rejection. I don't want to be selling to people all the time. Can I just code? And so that's how we set it up. And almost all of our first hires ended up being programmers who were more apprentice level, who I would basically bring in and I teach them and train them as we went. So a huge amount of my time and energy was like teaching them and then making sure their code was good. And one of the things we learned really early on was that like the amount of my time that was spent just cleaning up code style things was inordinately higher than the amount of time that was spent like talking about architecture and structure and implementation in the way that actually will matter for performance. And we can talk in a second about why I was spending that time doing that. But in the end, it just kind of left me like not wanting to do that. And at that time, Adam Wathan worked at Titan. And he's like, well, here's my idea. You have a code standard, right? And I was like, yeah, totally. And there's no GitHub Actions at this point. There are a lot of tools around there to automate things. So he built a tool, and I wish I could remember the name of it. I think it's still on the internet. And he built a tool that automates basically the PSR whichever it was at the time that links your stuff. And so it would basically pull it up, and then would put a whole bunch of issues on your pull request and say, hey, you need to go fix this. And later, Graham came along with Style CI, and that was kind of the one that was a little bit more integrated in Laravel. But at that point, he was just sort of like, "Hey, this is a thing that we need. We're going to build this tool." And so we just like implemented this tool in all of them. And that was actually the beginning of the story. So tlint and now Duster, those all came later. At the very beginning, it was just this inherent idea that like we shouldn't have, and I think that was even the pitch on Adam's website, is like you shouldn't waste your time, on commas and periods and double quotes and stuff like that. When you're doing code review should be about what's unique to this actual, piece of code. So
Yeah.
that was the foundation for us. I'm guessing you had a similar one, right? Like you're reviewing people's code and you're like, hey, I don't want to deal with this.
I mean, I think my story is a little different. It's similar, but you know, I I worked on this code base for decades, uh, and or a decade before anyone joined,
Yeah.
and then I had one other developer working with me for years, um, and so when we got to a place where there were a few different people working on the code base, um, it was in a very opinionated place.
Yes.
um, and yeah, I think that to some degree, um, I am the type of person who has a hard time letting go of those things. So it's
Mhm.
like if I see it, it's going to drive me nuts. So
Yeah.
we ended up either having the conversations or I would just go in and like modify people's PRs to like change the style because I
Yeah.
didn't want to like I felt bad about like
Making them go to
telling them to do it, but I still
Yep.
couldn't merge it without the change being in there.
Yep.
There's a little bit of that. Um, but I also think that, as we got to a place and we're still only a team of 3 people, um, but as we got to a place where a couple different people were constantly contributing the code, and I was contributing less, consistency of code just started to matter more. And and yeah, it just felt like at that point we had adopted some of the existing, we were using style CI, uh, we were using some of the existing linting and formatting tools out there. We all use PHP Storm, so we had like a set sort of coding standard file
Yeah.
that everyone used in there. Um, but all of those solutions still don't solve this question of like, we just don't do it this way or we always do it that way, like
Yeah.
these very common things, because it's like it doesn't really matter if you do things in an evented way or a non-evented way, or if you like you know use facades or global helper methods or load things directly out of the service container. Like none of that stuff matters, but it is a lot harder to parse code when it's the
Inconsistent.
same thing
Yeah.
is done in 4 different ways across
100%.
4 different files,
Yeah.
and I think that started to be more apparent as different people came in with just like different default ways of doing things,
Yeah.
Um, and so it sort of transitioned away from, I think in the beginning, me wanting to sort of enforce this like neuroses that I have
Yep.
to a real
Yeah.
practical value.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think predictability is something that's like really important there is like understanding where something's going to be, how it's going to look, how it's supposed to be. Is both important from like a discoverability thing. Like I need to find where this is going to happen. It's also important from a review. Like, is this done correctly or not, according to what we're expecting? Correctly doesn't mean correctly in the world. It means correctly for this pull request. So this pull request is in the context of what it's supposed to do for product. It's in the context of what code is around it, and it's a context of the specific code base. And so, like, what it's supposed to look like does not mean that that's what every implementation of that same set of code should do in the universe. But there is like a way for a senior engineer to say, this should or should not look like this. And there's some variety, right? Like somebody might do a temporary variable or not a temporary variable, but there's also some things that are narrower than just like, this is the way it always should be done. No, but we can say there are defined ways that at this company or in this code base, it should be done like this. And when it's not like that, you lose some of that predictability, you lose some of that discoverability. You also kind of like when somebody's reviewing, they now have to like see the thing that's wrong and decide, say that's wrong, and also it doesn't bother me. And the thing is, as someone who writes code, when you see code written different than the way your brain has been trained, this is what to do, this is what to do, this is what to do, it kind of like uses up some of your mental energy, right? And
yeah,
so
for
like
sure.
part of it is just minimizing the amount of time and mental energy and space that these reviewers have to spend, or senior developers or whatever have to spend looking at things that are outside of the norm, right? So like if that's going to be noticed anyway, why don't we let the computer notice and change it and then move on with our days, right?
100%. Yeah. And I mean, I think it also opens up a bunch of new possibility around, well, there are certain things that are like if it's always consistently done as one way over the course of the project, you actually do benefit from that. So like
Yeah.
a good example is, form request objects, right? If you as a team just decide like, we're always going to put prepare for validation before rules, and we're always going to put authorize before prepared for, whatever the order is. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
what the order is. I like to think about it as like, we're going to put these major methods in the order that they are executed within
Exactly. Same here.
the
Yeah.
code. Well, now if you're looking at a file, you don't have to like open up the like symbol list or scroll down to look like, is
You know where
there
it's going to be.
something
Yeah.
that's like manipulating the inputs? You just know at the top of the file, either there is a prepare for validation method or there isn't,
There's none one at all. Yeah.
and I think that for a lot of different things that can be really true for requests. I think that's true for tests, having consistent naming and tests, and where do you put your data providers? Where do you put your setup and teardown methods? Like just ensuring that that's always the same. Yeah, it reduces that the cognitive load of the reviewer, but it also reduces the whole team's cognitive load as they revisit these files, because it's just like, I
Yeah.
always know that setup is at the top, right?
Yeah.
And there's never going to be a file where there's like a setup method that accidentally got placed like third down for some random reason, right? Like that just got missed by a human eye, but like the linter just won't let that happen, right?
Yeah.
Or controllers is another great example. Like just having your controller actions always in the order of like, create, store. It just simplifies the way you process that code.
Yeah.
And I do think there are actually meaningful benefits there.
Yeah. Yeah. And models are a really good example because you spend a decent amount of time interacting with models, and you need to know, well, is this an accessor? Is this a publicly declared field?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something going on in the boot method? And so your ability to understand a model that you've never seen or interacting for the first time in a while is significantly improved when, like you're saying, if you go to the model and you hit the accessor section, there's no accessors. That means there's no accessors. And so this thing that might be an accessor is not, it's something else. It's just that predictability, that ability to kind of like step into something. And it's funny because you and I were talking the other day about modular design, which we won't talk about here, but the same question I had about that applies here, which is like, how do we write code that makes it easy for people to walk into, whether it is someone who's been on this project for the last 10 years and wrote that code 8 years ago, or been on it for the last 10 years and somebody else wrote that code, or somebody else wrote that code yesterday and they're reviewing it, or they're new, like all these different spaces where we step into code that is not fresh in our brain. What does it look like to maximize people's ability to understand that, to not make mistakes because you're duplicating something because you didn't see where it was, or you have to dive longer, whatever. Like there's so many things where the goal is to make it easy for people to see. And I wanted to note something that you mentioned here that we forgot to talk about. When we're talking about these linters, there's like the standard PHP code sniffer linters and stuff like that, which tend to more be around comma placement, quotes, and stuff like that. And one of the reasons that we've both independently built tools is because those often don't catch Laravel specific things, and they don't often catch the things like in what order are your methods or something like that. And so that's, at least for us, we wrote tlint not to be the be all end all linter, but to give things for us to be able to control that you can't control with all the existing tools like PHPCS and PHPCS Fixer and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because those tools are great. Everyone should be using them at this point.
Yeah.
I'm not, because of the sort of history of our code, to some degree, I can claim that that's the reason and not just this is preference. But I'm not 100% a subscriber to all the PSR standards, even though I know that for most people that's just easier and better.
Yeah.
I am still holding on to my tabs with my bloody hands over here.
You're a better man than me. I had to let it go. I gave it up at the very beginning, and only later was like, you mean I don't have to always follow every single thing the standards say? But at that point, it was too late. So
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm gonna go there. The experience of like interacting with code that is indented with spaces is still just like frustrating to me, because unless I don't know, it's just not as good to use. But anyway, but it doesn't even matter. Like all of that stuff is like you should have software that just normalizes it for you, right?
Mhm.
Like tabs or spaces, fundamentally, whatever you commit to the code base should just be whatever the tool does, right?
Yeah.
And and I think you have to accept that every once in a while the tool forces you to write code that's not quite the way that you would do if you were like handcrafting every single line.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just the reality every once in a while. But the vast majority of the time, it does a perfectly good job, and the consistency is well worth the like 3 lines in my code base that I look at and I'm like, I
Yeah.
wish that was indented differently.
Which is an interesting kind of transition to talk about who is it that is defining these standards. So we have definitely covered the fact that like standards are a good idea. Okay, cool. We believe that, but it's very interesting because your point at the beginning was, talking about over engineering. This is us implying or like imposing our standards on the world, and we can tell you why there is a standard, but the question of why is there this standard definitely comes down to because I was here first. Because I'm the
Yeah,
boss, it's so funny.
100%.
Like when I started trying to teach people how to code at the beginning, I realized I was like, oh, the standard is just like write this like Matt would. Like that's literally, and I was like, is that a bad thing? And I was like, well, we got to pick some standard. So
Right.
I guess that's it. Have you ever had an employee like, any particularly spicy employees who've worked with you before push back and say, this is you need to change this and it should be different?
Um, I think that when Daniel came to work at InterNACHI,
Not
he had a hard
Daniel.
time.
I
He had
couldn't
a hard
imagine
time.
Daniel being the spicy employee.
What's so funny to me now is all the things that he complained so heavily about. Like I see his code now, and he's still doing all of it.
Uh-huh.
I'm like, I gotcha.
Gotcha.
um, yeah, we've really only had like a handful of people ever
Yeah,
work on the
fair.
code base, so it's like that I'm so grateful for that. I had um, one developer working with me from 2007, 2006 on until just last year. And then, the folks that are working here, one's been here a few years, the other just started last year, but like, I'm sure hoping that they're going to be long-term,
Yeah.
uh, really caretakers of the code. Um, and so, yeah, I haven't had to deal with that as much. And I do think, I don't know if this is me. I don't know if this is me just sort of like trying to come up with a rationalization for my
Mhm.
beliefs. I don't think it is. Because I actually, I don't remember when I made this decision, but there was a point when I had been reading um I'd been reading research on just like code readability and like looking at the whole sort of light theme versus dark theme argument and
Mhm.
a couple other things just like I was just curious like what is it there is research on this stuff. What does the research actually say? um True procrastination at the like
Right.
the pinnacle, right?
Yeah.
um and I basically came upon like uh light themes are better objectively and snake case is better. And I was like, I think I'm just gonna give myself like 2 weeks of trying that and
Yeah.
see, you know?
Yeah.
And, and we eventually changed our code standard to, I don't care what theme people use, right? But,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I use a light theme now. I had been consistently, dark theme, lover, but, when I finally switched over, I was like, "Oh, yeah, I actually can read this significantly
Yeah.
better. This is great."
Yeah.
Um, and the casing is the other one where it's like, yeah, it's not the PSR standard, but when you get long variables that are snake cased, I just they just are easier to read.
Yeah.
And
So do you do it on method or on class properties as well?
no, we on class properties, yes, but
Okay.
methods we still do camel case. Yeah, we have a little bit of a baroque system. It makes sense in my head. And there is a rule. It's snake case for anything that holds a value, uh, camel case for anything that is callable, and
Makes sense.
kebab case for anything that is a path. So like
Okay.
if it's in a URL, if it's a file, it's kebab case, and that just comes from like the old Google days when
Yeah.
that mattered.
Yeah.
Um, Snake case for variables and properties, and then camel case even and like it gets interesting because even if you have a variable that is referencing a closure, like I will camel
Still
case
snake
that.
casing. Oh, you
No, no, no.
will because it's
Yeah, so that
callable.
it's like this is a
Sure.
function. It happens
Yeah.
to be a variable, but
Yeah.
um
Huh.
and I don't,
But
I'm not going to argue that it's the best way, but it works for us, and I don't mind being non-standard for some of these little things.
yeah, I mean, and in the end, as long as it can be like a question can be asked, is it this or is it that, and you can answer based on your spec, then whatever. But I'm
Yeah.
curious. I I don't think the PSRs specify variable naming. Do they specify class property naming style?
I thought that PSR did specify camel for variable names. I'm not sure. Maybe it's just the
I don't.
convention.
I think they don't. I can't tell you for sure,
Interesting.
but I suspect that you'll find that that's when they don't actually specify, and just some people just kind of assume that because they specify that methods should be camel cased, then therefore variables should be as well. But I've
Interesting.
also seen the same stuff that that Snake is a lot better, and we for the longest time have named our tests with Snake because it's just so
It's so
much
much.
more legible.
That's
So,
another one. For some reason, it drives me nuts. The at test annotation on every test
mhm.
method in a PHP unit test, instead of just naming the function with
Test
the word test at
underscore.
the beginning, like,
Uh-huh.
and that's one of the ones that we enforce with laralint. Like,
Yeah.
just why spend the extra line and the extra characters when you're typing test anyway? Just include it in the method name.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is true. Almost everyone uses snake case for test methods just because they're so long. It's impossible to read if it's camel
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. And you're also writing them like a sentence. I feel like one of the benefits of camel case in your method names is you give yourself sort of, the longer a camel cased method name is, the harder it is to understand. So it sort of almost forces you into shorter method names. And I'm like, okay,
Right.
that's a noble, outcome of this, I guess.
Yeah, that's not bad. That's not bad.
Okay, so I want to talk real quick about the implementation story for us. So we originally had a guy, Logan, who was just like one of those like uber brilliant guys who just he's like learning Elm is at the same time, and he's
Mhm.
building Laravel Elm and this kind of stuff. And so when he said I want to make one of these, I was like, does it duplicate anything that's already out there? He's like, no. I was like, okay, cool, go for it. So he builds tlint, and then he leaves on to get a job doing Elm, as one does, and that's totally fine. Um, and it leaves with our love and after years of great work, whatever, but at some point he leaves, right? And so we've got a new guy, Anthony Clark. He's not new anymore, but at the time, who's like, hey, I kind of want to take this over. I was like, great. Number one job is to ensure that nothing in tlint duplicates stuff that can already be done in PHPCS or PHPCS Fixer. We don't need to be maintaining work there. And so he looked and he's like, that's not entirely true. So we shrank the scope of tlint down a bunch. And so I was like, well, let's publish maybe like together the tlint, like we'll publish our own PHPCS configuration. And he and I went back and forth a bunch of times. And one day in a fit of entrepreneurial ADHD, I just was like, I'm going to make a new package. And the new package is Duster. And Duster it brings in PHPCS and PHPCS Fixer. It brings in the confusingly named Pint or Pint, depending on how you pronounce it. And then it brings in tlint. And it basically is like here's the preference of all Titan pod projects across everything. And you don't have to configure and learn tlint or whatever. You just install Duster. Here's how to customize it. But like out of the bat, this is actually everything. Because the thing is, tlint is never everything we wanted. Tlint
Sure.
was like things that were hard to program somewhere else. So now Duster is actually like, if you put Duster and you run Duster Fix or Duster Lint, that is the be all end all for our projects. And for non-Titan folks, they can of course customize it, tweak it. It's just kind of like a convenient way to get a package with some pre-built rules across a lot of different code bases or code sniffers. But for Titan projects, I'm like, just install it at the beginning of the project and then just set up the do you use Husky at all for local, or do you only do this kind of stuff in CI?
We do. We just switched away from Husky to another one of those tools.
Okay, but same idea,
But
local
same
GitHooks and stuff.
idea. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah.
We mostly leave it to CI, but the CS Fixer and laralint run as Git hooks.
Okay. Yeah. And it's interesting because one of the differences between Adam's package, I wish I could remember the name of it, and Style CI at the beginning. Well, first of all, Adam's came out first, but then Style CI came out and Graham was just pushing it everywhere. Graham was like, he would pull request it in every single thing. And so it just kind of like, and Adam just was like, yeah, I've already moved on. I'm making Tailwind and stuff. Right. But the biggest difference between them was that Style CI could automatically format it for you, whereas Adams was just leaving the comments. And that was really a deal breaker for a lot of people, because while it's very nice for it to be automated, if it automatically tells you to change something like linting, it's kind of a pain in the butt unless it's directly in your IDE. Like if it's outside of the space of your IDE, you just want it to fix it for you, right?
Yeah.
So I've found that like my general metric is, if I don't have to think about it, that is the ideal way of a linter running, unless it's in my IDE. If it's in my IDE and it's going ding, ding, ding right in the moment, totally fine. But the moment we're outside of the IDE, I want it to say, oh, you're telling me you reformatted the code before the commit finished? Fine. You're telling me that you reformatted that code in the CI? Occasionally fine. But the problem is reformatting it in CI means there's an extra pull or an extra commit added. So now I start working and I push and it's like, oh, you're out of sync with the remote. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm out of sync with the remote. I'm the only one who pushed.
This is
it's
my
like,
branch.
Oh, CI, whatever. So that's the reason. The one reason I don't like CI is because of dealing with that, which it's not that big of a deal, but I still hate it. So that's why I'm a big fan of like the local kind of hook.
It's a little friction, right? And like a little friction over time
goes a long way.
Is a pain in the ass. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So our general goal is do the same thing in every project without thinking about it. You're not configuring it. You're not, making decisions. Install the freaking thing. And then every time you commit, it gets formatted. Every time you go up to CI, it catches just in case you didn't commit it. It's hooked into your IDE. It's just like, just don't ever think about it, because that's the whole point of this, right? The whole point is not to bike shed over, and I should pause. I asked you earlier if you've ever had any spicy employees who've come in and pushed at it. And I joke because I love it when people come along and they're like, I think we should have a standard here, or I think the standard here is wrong. Because that's such a fun moment for the company to all bring their experiences and their thoughts. And I love when I'm wrong, right? I love it when I'm like, well, this is what I've been doing for 15 years. And they're like, yeah, but have you considered this? And I'm like, oh, I haven't. That's great, because it means I'm learning. But once we're done with that moment, then I want us to never think about the conversation ever again and for it to be automated. You know what I mean? So it's both. I want people to be able to bring it up in the right spaces, but when we're coding, let's just freaking code,
Yeah. Yeah. No, every once in a while we'll have those, like, this is, just one of those things where it's like, this has come up a couple of times. Let's all just like take 20 minutes, decide the way we're going to do it. And then we'll add a linter rule and then it'll be done,
Yep.
And it only happens every once in a while, but it does happen. And it's fun. I don't know. I think this is a tangent, but I've been thinking about this a lot. I think in the context of sort of this, like the remix versus Laravel sort of debate, and a lot of the conversation about what makes Laravel so great often got summed up to, well, it just lets me build the thing that I want to build and be done with it, like actually build a productive thing that makes money, right?
Yeah.
And that is great, right? That, of course, that the fact that Laravel makes that possible is a huge reason why we're all using it.
Yeah.
But I do think that there was an undertone in that conversation of like, people who just want to like explore and experiment with like, what is the absolute best way hypothetically to do something, even if it's not great yet, that somehow that's bad. And I think that there needs to be a good balance of those two things, right? Like, I've talked a lot about programming as art on this podcast, and I feel very strongly that programming is art, that it's a creative pursuit. And art can have a destination, and art can have like, economic value, right? But it also can just be an experience. And like sometimes just getting in the really in the weeds on some stupid programming topic, that's kind of where this whole podcast started, was like, sometimes it's fun to just like really
Really nerd
allow
out.
yourself the time to
Yeah.
just argue about tabs versus spaces,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
why not? We People obviously get passionate about these topics, and we're all so in it. Sometimes sometimes it's worth it. I think
Yeah.
sometimes it is okay, not all
Yeah.
the time. Most
When
of the
it's
time you just need to move on, right?
and the art parallel is interesting because one of the reasons why people were kind of in this remix versus Laravel conversation, kind of shitting on the hyper fixation on a single modal, was because the people who are hyper fixating on a single modal were doing it critically, and I
Sure.
think there's a difference between doing it creatively versus doing something critically. So if you say, I as a creator, as an artist, want to hyper fixate on this particular piece of technology because I love searching for beauty and perfection and efficiency or whatever, then that's
Yeah.
like an artistic creative pursuit. And if you say your stuff is shit because your modal's not as fast as mine because you didn't hyperfixate on modals like I did, then you're a
Right.
jerk, right?
Yeah. Oh,
And
for
so
sure.
like, and that's not to speak to disagree with what you're saying at all, because I think that what's often missing in that space is someone who said, your modals are slow, and the other person said, yeah, but they make money. They heard you don't care about art. And the person who's
Right.
saying, yeah, they make money, was hearing you're not good enough because you didn't hyperfixate on modals. Like,
Right.
can we talk past each other a little bit less in this freaking
Yeah.
conversation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking about different things
Yeah.
and hearing different things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And bike shedding is a joy for programmers to be able to do,
Right.
like, and it's funny because I'm very much one of those people who's like, look, did programming allow you to satisfy the client? Did programming allow you to put food on your family's table? Then it did the job. I don't care how perfect your modals were. And also, I love the idea of us like focusing on how to do things really well and elegantly and efficiently and beautifully, and then passing that knowledge on to other people. And like those things can be true at the same time. And I've been with teams before where they're pressured so hard by business and product in the company to produce that they're never ever given any space to care about doing it right and doing it good and doing it efficiently. And not only is that burning them out, because they don't get any space to be creative, they're just kind of like machines for production. But then also it ends up, getting rid of some of their thoughtfulness and some of their insight, and then therefore something blows up down the road because they were being kind of basically whipped to just produce dollars for the capital machine. So it's so weird
Yeah.
that there are extremes of every single part of this story.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's all murky,
Yeah.
what, and finding like the right spot is impossible. But yeah, I mean, I think that like the question, obviously the question, like, did it do what it needed to do? And, are you, if this is your job, are
Hmm.
you like paying your bills because of it? Like, those are important questions, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think there's like also, do you feel fulfilled by what you do, right?
Yeah.
Like, unfortunately, a lot of people don't get to have that, and that is like an incredible thing that many programmers do get to have, right? So many programmers, there are plenty of programmers who this is not true. They just do it for a job, and that's fine. But there, a lot of programmers who do it because they did it for love first,
Yeah.
and they were pleasantly surprised that they could also get paid to do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, we have this incredible thing. Like, don't beat the beauty out of it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
we should be able to embrace that too,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it sounds really reductionist, but like sort of like if there's something that you're trying to do with your programming, you should be given space to do that thing. Whether that thing is, build a kind of scrappy, your modals aren't perfect, but it does the job for you, your client, you should be allowed to do that without people coming along and shitting on your modals. If your thing is to build the most perfect modal, that is hyper optimized down to the millisecond, nanosecond, then you should be given space to do that. And as long as you're not shitting on the people who do it different than you, then like great, you know,
Yeah.
wonderful. And the moment what you're about on the internet is making other people feel bad for how they do it, then you're the problem. It's not the fact that people are trying to make money by doing hyper optimized versions. It's not about the fact that people are trying to do hyper optimized super nuanced versions. It's the critical person who can't understand a way other than their own that is the actual source of the issue.
Yeah. I think that there's another piece to that particular conversation. I don't think that the original criticism necessarily falls into this, but I do think that there's a little bit of an element of like um the that like the folks behind Basecamp spend a lot of time talking about how great they are. uh and how great their process is and how great
For
their
sure.
software is.
Yeah.
Um I think it opens them up to be fairly criticized when their stuff
Yes.
is not great.
I agree. There's nuance to that specific topic for
Yes.
sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I do think that particular criticism was misguided, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Especially because I think, you can point out a lot of things about, hey, that's just like not a great experience. And if it works for you, that's fine.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for me.
Yeah, me neither. And that's so
And
funny. I'm so critical of Basecamp and Hey, So it's just like I've Ian is even more critical, Ian Landsman. And so Ian was like, I can't believe I'm out here defending DHH when I
yeah,
love criticizing DHH. I'm the same way. I'm like, I
his
don't want to
reaction
be on
was
your team.
great.
Yeah.
I think his take was perfect in that conversation,
Yeah.
DHH's.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have I have complicated feelings about DHH because I've read some of those books and felt very inspired by them.
Same. Yeah.
And then, you'll be reading, just here's what we do. And the proof that it's so great is that we are so great. And then you
Yeah.
like look at some of you look at the software that they build and you look at some of the uh, mass exodus of employees due to mismanagement. And you're like, oh, how do I square these two things?
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. And I appreciate you naming that because for me, this is much more in the abstract than the specific of Basecamp, right? I think that
100%.
Basecamp on one side and also, Remix and the other folks in Linear, each of them have their own, nuances of how we would feel about them.
Yeah. But
Mm.
I think why I originally said that is I think that Ryan Florence's sort of core statement that he was making was like, I want to build UIs that are perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm willing to sacrifice all of the niceties that like Rails and Laravel provide right now to get there eventually, And I love that. I love that for Remix. I love the like uh that pursuit, and like I think that it needs that whole ecosystem needs a lot more time to get to a place where you can really build applications easily with them.
Yeah.
But I think that they're doing really interesting things that will produce really incredible user interfaces and experiences once they figure out how to send mail, and connect to databases.
Okay, so I was sitting here about to say something. You just said it, but I'm going to say it anyway. Well, it's so fun because I agree with you that I think having people out there doing what they're doing raises all the ships, right? When somebody has done that, then we will all see what an interface can look like with that level of attention. And I'm sure blog posts and whatever things will kind of bring that back to us. So I think that there is value. Anytime somebody's hyper-focused on anything, there's value to be brought back. But it is also funny because you said, I love that. I love that for Remix. And it just made me laugh so much because there's like this Southern way of saying like, I love that for you. And what it means is it may not be my thing, but you know what, baby, if it makes you happy. So hearing you say, I love that I do love that for Remix. I don't want that for me, but I love that they're doing it. So, and again, I don't mean that critically, but it is the same thing. Like I can look at Remix, I can look at Ryan Florence and I can say, God bless you in your efforts. And I believe that I will probably one day get significant benefit from the work you're doing and say, thank you. I'm glad you did that. And I hope that I'm able to, in that day, give you something back, right? But I do not want to use your tool right now. And those things can be true at the same time. And it's okay, right? I don't need to go tell them stop, right?
Yeah,
like it's fine. Keep doing it. Have a great time. I'm not going to shit on your, and your fun.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Did you go down that path at all of like I just remember when Node first came out, um, the promise of, writing everything in one language was really, really
100%.
appealing.
Yes.
And, ironically to this day, like Node.js packages that I wrote are considerably more popular than the PHP packages that,
That's funny.
that I haven't maintained in a decade and
Yeah.
still, just because there still is so much interest in that space. But it is really appealing, the
Yes.
idea of writing code once and using it across the stack. And like, browsers don't run PHP. There's nothing we can do about that, right? So if you're going to do
Asterisk,
it,
but
it's got
yes.
to be yes, sure,
Yes. In
um,
reality, yeah. Yeah.
yes. So if it's
No,
going to
there's
be something, it's going to be JavaScript, right?
yeah,
And so, did you like go down that path much?
several times. Yeah. I've
Yeah,
written several Express apps. So when may I reveal my political leanings in this podcast? Is that
go
allowed?
ahead.
Okay. When Trump got elected, I got recruited by several political activism groups who are like, hey, we are technologists. We should use technology to try and basically fight Trump and
Yeah.
Trumpists. And so I was working with some of these groups, and they would have people from all across the technology stack, and not nary a one of them would use PHP. So there's two things that I did. And number one was I ran all their wikis because they're all in PHP, right? So I knew how to do all that kind of stuff. But the second thing is I would help them build tools that were contributor agnostic, because they needed to be able to bring in people who worked in whatever technology.
Mhm.
And that almost always meant that we built it in Node, because everybody knew JavaScript on the front end. And so we
Right.
could build these Node-based tools. And it was fun, man. Like, it
Yeah.
wasn't functional. It was a pain to have to put all the pieces together. But the
Yeah.
syntax, and also there's the fact with Node, you just kind of have like just this one file. With Express, at least, you have this one file,
Yes.
and it's got like 10 lines in it. And suddenly you got a whole freaking server spun up. And like, it was really sexy the way you can just do these massive things with these few. And like, for some reason, we did it without semicolons. So it was even like lighter and leaner. And I don't know why that one little
Uh-huh.
thing mattered. But I guess this is what this episode is about, right?
Yeah.
It's just this one freaking JS file that did so much. And
Yeah.
there was a part of me, and I was like, now granted, again, sending an email, good luck. Connecting to a database, good luck, or whatever. But also, I'm like, in my PHP world, I've got 300 files to start an application, and this thing, I've got literally one file, and it's so slim. And I'm like, oh, this is really
Yeah.
nice.
That is, I mean, I've also talked about this on the podcast a couple of times, but I'll say it one more time. I think in terms of PSR, I think that decision, the one file per class
Uh-huh.
decision, has hurt PHP pretty significant. Not, again, this is right on a scale of things. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter that much, but you see this like move towards finding ways to co-locate code in more like useful ways, and whether that's like Volt, or whether that's verbs, or whether that's like Tailwind. All of these things are kind of um around that idea of like, I want all the stuff that belongs together to live together, right?
yeah,
And the number of times that I have wished that I could just throw a form request class in the same file as the controller, that is the only place that form request will ever be used,
yeah,
um, is not zero.
yeah,
And that is when you go into the JavaScript world, it's like you open up these React files, and there's like 15 React components inside of one file, but they all basically they all accomplish one goal, right?
yeah,
And they're interdependent, um, but like some of them are 2 lines, right? It's just like a little wrapper that provides like a little bit of an API nicety, um, or something that's going to be reused internally a bunch of times. But it feels so much nicer to me. I
yeah,
I do think that experience of the JavaScript world is just consistently better in
yeah.
my opinion.
So
Um,
speaking of the niceties of the JavaScript world, since we're talking about formatting and everything here, have you had any dreams or desires or even participation in these side projects that would change the syntax of PHP to make it more concise? I mean, I've also had my days in Ruby, and I kind of went down the Rails road for a while before finding Laravel, and I still definitely miss the concision. Um, from both JavaScript and Ruby. And man, a lot of the ways that we have bucked the PSRs have been in order to make things less verbose. One of the PSRs required you to put parentheses when you're newing up an object that has no constructor parameters. I was like,
Mhm.
absolutely not. That's ridiculous. And I know it's just two freaking characters, right? But I'm like, we don't need more mess. So, and like I said, when I was able to do JavaScript, without semicolons, and I was like, oh, I love this. It's just that much cleaner. Have you ever participated in any of the PHP things, or do you have a dream of any sort of like what would make it different for us?
Every once in a while, I've gotten to the point where I don't know, I can't remember what it is anymore, but I have established the like C course that I would take to
Yeah.
learn some C so that I could try to start to contribute.
Yeah.
Um, because 100% yes. I mean, I feel like there's just some language features that I think are kind of no-brainers that would just make the language so much nicer to use. And I appreciate, I mean, I certainly understand the reason behind the fact that we don't have generics in PHP.
Mm-hmm.
It is an incredibly complicated problem to solve at runtime.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them for not wanting to do it. I still think we should have generics. I think that it should just be, that PHP introduces like a static type checker that just runs, and then at the runtime it ignores generics entirely. So that's my stance on generics. But there are things like that. There are a couple of. Have you ever written Kotlin?
No, I've seen it
Kotlin
before, but I've never written it.
It's an interesting language because it's on top of Java, but it's essentially taking Java and making it not awful to write, which Java is awful to write.
Yeah.
But
I've seen Java. I've also never written that Java, and I'm grateful for that.
I only wrote Java in college. I a little bit.
I wrote poems in college, so got an English degree.
Nice. Well, Kotlin is cool because it essentially is just like, hey, all the stuff that we can infer, we'll just infer, and you don't have to like do all the crazy syntax and pull in a million types and whatnot.
Yeah.
But like, we'll just put it in there for you when we actually compile it, but it just has some neat little features. Like, one thing that I love is closures that have a single input parameter, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just don't write the like function syntax. You just give it curly braces, and the parameter is called it. So like,
okay.
If you just imagine like a chain of like collection operations, like a map reduce type thing, where you're like, filtering some stuff out and then maybe uppercasing or changing the casing or whatever. Like, it's not that big of a deal to do like FN open parentheses and then like come up with some name. You could even call it $it, close parentheses, arrow, and then do your operation. But just there's something about just like in Kotlin, it's just curly brace it dot uppercase or whatever, curly brace.
That's
nice. And that's the whole little things like that I think would just allow folks to write slightly more expressive code. It's not make or break, but and the other one is essentially there's a syntax where you can define a variable as a type.
Okay.
And then or return. And so like you can essentially just be like, as long as this is this type, let's keep on going, but otherwise just return null, and then as long you end up just like having these like little guard statements at the top that don't take 15 lines, but it's still giving you a little bit, it's giving you more of that type.
See, it's stuff like that
assurance.
that I want, man.
Yeah,
it's like,
for sure.
give me the ability to do little convenient things without it being now, the most common one is 4 lines, right? Like conditional, opening brace, action, closing brace, line. But even that, 4 lines sprinkled in every single method, and then sometimes your body, your guard is more than 1 line, and just man, like it's rough.
Yeah. I mean, we are in a great place where we have a language that can do everything that we need practically.
Yes. which
Um,
leads us to bike shed. Right? It's
yeah,
like Maslow's hierarchy of programming needs. Like, does it do the
right.
basics? Yes. And now we're going to bike shed on syntax things,
Hmm.
which is, it's a sign of a healthy environment, I guess. We're
Yeah,
safe,
yeah, yeah. No, it's true, but yeah, that doesn't mean that we can't want better for the language and for
Yes,
the for the community and
exactly.
everything, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you? Have you gone down that path much?
No, I mean there was one of the, P and a couple others. I remember the PHP
Hmm.
people were talking about an alternate syntax, and the Zeev was with that, and then I think that Nuno Maduro was talking about one for a while. And I've always been a big fan of all of them. I've always basically said, like, if you do it, I will put money and time behind it.
Yeah.
Which is funny because I've also often been critical of people using anything other than just like the plainest Janus of PHP or of Laravel or whatever, because I'm like, you got to stick with the basics, and if it's not officially sanctioned, be careful. But I think that the number one thing holding PHP back right now is just the syntactical verbosity. The number two thing being just bad marketing and a bunch of nerds who are so stuck in their way that they won't think about, like,
Yeah.
the fact that Laravel does marketing is not something you guys should look down on. It's actually one of the reasons why PHP exists right now, is because Laravel's out here marketing it. Maybe we can, I get annoyed because the amount of time and energy I put into trying marketing, PHP and stuff like that, and just people won't bite. It's just driving me nuts. But anyway, that's not what your question was. There have been multiples of those, and each time I get really excited. If
Yeah.
I could write PHP classes like they were Ruby, if I could write PHP controllers like they were Ruby, just these things like these, like implicit returns, and even just honestly, there's a part of me that wants to like go buck a lot of the PSRs and start writing, single line conditionals and stuff like that. And I'm just like, I don't know, maybe. Yes, I've thought about it a lot. And then one of the first things I said I wanted in tlint was get rid of the automatically generated doc blocks for a lot of Laravel classes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm just like that. Yes, that is helpful for the framework. That does not mean we need it in our application. They can those,
Yeah.
people are like, well, it came from Laravel, so it must be good. I'm like, no, it was good in Laravel, and now we don't need it in our code base. So stuff
Yeah.
like that, man. I'm just like, clean that stuff up as much as possible. So yeah.
There are some. I mean, it's funny because I agree with the sentiment. I actually feel like I love semicolons and I love braces on conditionals because uh I remember when that was not the norm,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember the hours that I spent
Trying
debugging
to find,
code
yeah,
because of a missing
yeah,
brace or a missing semicolon. And in JavaScript it's even worse because in JavaScript there's only like 4 scenarios where the semicolon matters, right? But like if you don't know what those 4 scenarios are,
agreed.
it's just
Yeah,
like a nightmare.
yeah,
And because tools can just put the semicolon there, it's like why I don't know why even argue. It's just like it's going to save you 1 in a million times. It's the same thing. I also feel the same way about the down method in migrations.
yeah,
In
100%.
all the time that I've been using Laravel, I've done it at least once, maybe twice in production, run down
Yeah,
because um and this is partially because of like legacy reasons. Um the actual code in production had been migrated through so many different versions of MySQL that like there was data that shouldn't be allowed to be in the format that it was, but it was because it just had come along for the ride, right?
oof,
And
yeah,
so you run this migration and suddenly everything blows up. And the 4 minutes that I saved by being able to run PHP, artisan migrate down and then go do the fix
uh-huh.
instead of having to like write a new PR that fixes the migration, and like
Yeah,
that saved my team hours of phone calls. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
um, so I lean towards a little bit like do the safe thing, even
okay,
if it's a little bit more verbose. But fundamentally, I still agree with the one the like uh there should that we should continue to move the language forward. You
yeah.
know,
Well, it's
and I
interesting
do.
because okay,
No, go ahead.
I know that the don't have a down method folks tend to be the delete the doc block folks, but I actually keep my down methods because I think there's an actual functional benefit. And it's funny because I actually can't tell you if I've ever used one in production, but I still do it on principle because to me, a down method is not visual cruft. It's not, and it's very much, I know, like the internet just kind of lost their minds when Jeffrey Way was talking about whatever it was, like visual whatever
Yeah,
complexity.
yeah.
But that's the thing to me. I don't actually need to get rid of a functional thing because it's not useful, even though maybe I should get rid of my down methods because I never use them. It's more like there's a bunch of stuff that I don't need, you know?
Right.
And I agree with you that like there's a world of braces and all this kind of stuff where when they're missing, things are less complex. But I've also seen Ruby and JavaScript written in a way where it's still clear. And like,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I want. So I'm not even saying
Mm-hmm.
the answer is to get rid of braces that are conditionals. I just love that really terse,
Yeah.
concise syntax. That's all. Give me however, you know?
That's the thing is like we should be imagining what syntax can be both like
Yeah.
terse and
Clear.
safe,
Yeah.
right?
100%
Yeah.
agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um I was going to say I do think the experiment that I have been sort of tinkering with. The whole reason that I got into Kotlin was I wanted to write PHP Storm plugins. Um I I am like the biggest fan of Alpine JS, and I am also a slave to my IDE's autocomplete.
Got it.
Um, and so I was just like, I
Guess I'm gonna learn
want
Kotlin.
my IDE to
Uh-huh.
understand Alpine.
Yeah.
So I wrote an Alpine plugin for PHP Storm, and it's not perfect, but it does, it gets the job done.
Yeah.
Um, but in doing that, I went down this rabbit hole of like, you know, language like lexing and parsing and there's a lot of tooling around these IntelliJ plugins that support that stuff. So
Mhm.
it made me realize, I say it wouldn't be that hard. This is probably months and months of work, right? It wouldn't be that hard to write a Storm plugin that could, provide syntax highlighting on like some sort of format that was one layer above PHP, like something
Mhm.
that was baseline PHP but had some new syntax. Um, and so I've been thinking about this idea, like Blade, right, is just transpiled to PHP at runtime, right? That's
Yeah.
all it really is. It's just it's using the autoloader and taking that file and just reading it and writing it to a PHP file and then including
Yeah.
that file. So I was like, why couldn't that be done with something else? Um, and the one that I would love to do is I would love like a dedicated format for routes files.
Okay.
uh, I I feel like, especially an app our size, you tend to have routes that get long because you just like you ran out all the short ones.
Yeah.
Right. um and we do named routes, and we use a system where the like breadcrumbs are tied to the routes, so
Okay.
every
Yeah.
single route is like typically 3 lines of code,
Yeah.
um which functionally is great for us. But I do like really envy those like route files that's just like straight down the line and just
Uh-huh.
have like
Yeah.
the
Route
the
colon
route on the
whatever.
left and
Tick
then
tick tick
the
tick tick tick.
yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
um and I was just like, what if there was some sort of just like CSV type format,
Yeah.
that
Uh-huh.
could just magically be parsed into PHP. I don't know. That's my weird fantasy PHP syntax.
And so that's how everything eventually turns into YAML, right?
Mm,
I'm
don't get me
I
started.
tab separated or no, tab delimited is definitely something that's very interesting to me. Not tab
Hmm.
delimited. I'm sorry. The tab delimited is interesting, but the problem is tab delimited is not very visually. Pipe delimited. I've seen
Mm,
people that use basically pipe delimited, effectively CSVs, for a way to give yourself, because I think some of the pipe delimited CSVs type formats are not space sensitive. So you basically end up basically like kind of like spacing them all to line up. But then almost every single time they run into like, well, what happens when one of the entries, is a little bit longer, and then now you've got to go hit And I'm just like, nah, no, this is our tooling is not built for that. But it would be very
Yeah.
interesting if there was a way to have tooling that is built for that. You know, the Table Plus people just put out a CSV
Mm-hmm.
navigator tool, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, is there a way for that to overlap with your idea in a way that makes it even more compelling?
Right.
Because now you can explore your routes in a way you couldn't before.
I mean, I think there's so much there are some really significant opportunities to like explore just totally new abstractions. Um, a thing that comes to mind is, did you ever see Darklang?
Yes. Uh huh.
They're just like sort of, it's a new language, but also like it's the way you edit it is kind of like fundamentally built into the language.
Yeah.
There's not really this concept of files. There's just
Yeah.
like everything is connected the way it's connected, and like you navigate it through those connections. And I just think like, yeah, why are we still thinking in files?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
why haven't people come up with like new interesting ways to like abstract those concepts away? Like why am I even thinking about the file system, right?
Yeah.
Like we know, like my IDE knows how every class is
Yeah.
connected to every other class. Like give me some sort of like amazing graph view of my
Mhm.
code. Let me like see my code base in 3 dimension. I don't know. Like
Yeah.
maybe it's just people have tried and it's a terrible idea.
Well, I
But
mean, like when you were saying you weren't sure about the fact that the PSRs defined that every single class should be in a single file, one of my first thoughts was like, well, I really like the fact that I can hit Command P in VS Code and then type the name of the file and know it'll give me the name of the class. And I was like, wait a minute, my IDE is already aware of symbols, so I could just still get that same value out of it if it weren't in the same files. But I still am very much like and this came up in the modules conversation. I would really like to be able to just say, give me this particular class and not care about where it lives, right? I mean, we were talking about that. But the thing is, if that's how I'm navigating, that means that the file structure doesn't matter at all
yeah,
from just that navigation perspective. The point that you made in the modularity conversation is that it does matter from a discoverability. Like, how do I understand before I know what file to look for? How do I know what files are actually there? And the fact that we have one file per class, and then we can just look at the files as they're laid out, does aid discoverability. And so
I don't. I disagree. I think it's the opposite.
tell me more.
Imagine instead, right? Like right now, you have a feature, right? You're building, I don't know, like a team feature, right? So you got
Mhm.
a team controller, you got a team form request, you got a team model, you got some team emails, you got some team events that are broadcast,
Mhm.
right? In terms of discoverability, if we think about like my IDE knows that if I like command space and start typing team, it can take me to the team class, right? Like
Mhm.
any major PHP IDE can do that, right?
Right.
Um, so if all of those files were actually just one file called team,
Mhm.
right? Team.php, and like you just when you know what you're looking for, you just hit command space and start typing team controller, or team team request or whatever, and it just jumps you straight to that line in the file. But if you are like, okay, you're onboarding onto this like new project, and someone's like, okay, we're going to need you to add like a new feature to the team's feature in
Mhm.
our in the product. Like now you just have one file to just scroll, like look top to bottom, and you understand the entire thing. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's essentially what modular is, but just in
Yeah.
file system
Folders
organization.
versus yeah.
Yeah. Um, but I would argue that like modular is only because modern PHP standards require us to put files, and really you with Composer, unless you wanted to write your own like autoloader system, you
Yeah.
really have to go that path,
Yeah.
like you're
I
pretty
mean, it
much
wouldn't even have to be
stuck.
an autoloader system if you don't want. It could be literally just say load the files in slash app slash modules. Just load every PHP file in there. Like you can do
Hmm.
that with files. So because you can
Yeah.
glob in the files thing, right? You can just say every file under this directory. Yeah. So
You
we're
could.
not used to
And
having to do that, but it's not the end of the world, you know?
right. Right. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I get what you're saying, but I do think it's actually maybe arguably the opposite. I don't know.
I guess I hear you. I think that we need some way, but the interesting point was I was actually agreeing with you that if we were to move to a point where there's no files at all, we would need a new way to visualize. So there's
Yes.
right
Yeah.
now opening up your folder structure in Finder or whatever else shows you the, let's call them modules. You got your modules, and in the modules you got the files, and the files or the folders in the modules tell you what type of code is served in this particular module. And I'll notice that this particular module has an HTTP directory, but this module doesn't. And so now I have learned things about those modules. Whereas if all the files are in the team, my way to all the files for the team module are in one file. My way to discover that now becomes opening up the file and maybe looking at the list of symbols in that file. It
Yep.
doesn't make one better or different or better or worse, but it just means that somehow we need discoverability of the class structure organized by whatever module
By
or
something.
type or whatever, and we need to be able to visualize that. And so if we were to go in that kind of dark lang directory, then we would need something like you're talking, or direction, sorry, we would need something like you're talking about, which is the ability to understand and visualize what's going on here. Otherwise we lose significantly our discoverability.
Yeah. But actually it occurs to me that like the file system is really holding us back because it means that you have to pick one.
Yeah,
Right?
no, fair.
Like right now, I have to put something in, we were just talking about it. So for the listener, uh, Matt and I were talking about modular off air before, and that's like we keep on referencing back to it. So but we have a scheduling system, right, at InterNACHI. We also have this special program that we're running for the state of Florida, right? And the special program that we're running for the state of Florida interacts with the scheduling system. So these two modules are interdependent in certain ways. And you and I were talking about like, how do you know where to put something? And my answer generally is just like, you just have to pick. It's fine. Like sometimes you get it wrong and you move it, and that's fine. But the reality is like there are files that belong in this Florida specific thing that also arguably belong in the scheduling system because they're scheduling specific um, implementations
Yeah.
for this one special program, right? And so, like the file system forces me to put it in one. I should be able to just put it in both, right? So that when you're browsing the scheduling system, you see all the scheduling stuff. When you're browsing
Yeah.
this program, you see just that program specific stuff. Like
Hmm.
it really
It's
is
like a
kind of
tagging
like
kind of system where like this thing has
right,
both tags.
right.
Yeah, because Symlinks don't do that because you can't have PSR working, auto loading working correctly and have it in both places. I mean, I don't know if you've used Slab at all, but we use Slab at work, which is like Notion, but it has some features that made us choose it over Notion. And I appreciate the fact that it organizes everything in a folder structure, but the folders are actually tabs or tags, and you can tag something with multiple different things. So you navigate through the folders, and it shows up in two different folders because it has those two different tags. And at first, it kind of hurt my brain. And now I'm really glad for it because I do like a folder structure for discovery and navigation, and I like the ability for something to show up in both places when I need it in a different context. So I'm a big fan of your idea here.
Yeah, I mean, and like theoretically, I could have that already. Like, I assume the VS Code does this. PHP Storm has the concept of um, like named groups, right? So every once in a while I've done this where I'm working on a feature where I need to touch a bunch of like weirdly
Oh,
disparate
yeah.
files,
Yeah.
and I'll just like put them in a collection, or I can't remember what they're called in the IDE, but like, it's favorites, right?
Yeah.
But favorites can have groups, right?
Meta folder or something.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah.
And theoretically, I guess like I could go in and manually do that for every file in the project, right? But that would be awful, right? I'm not going to do it. So something like this would have to be as convenient as the file system, but also provide that flexibility. But it'd be cool.
Yeah, and I mean our IDEs are already showing us so that we can interact with something a level above the file system, because while they are showing us the file system, we're not interacting with the file system directly. And like I was teaching my son how to code this morning, and already off the bat, I was trying to show him the file system and then show him how like the file system in the terminal, and then show him how Finder in the Mac tries to represent it. He's like, well, where are all those files? And I was like, oh yeah, that's hiding those files from you. And there's dot files and this, that, and the other. So I'm already kind of like intimately aware of the idea that like, yes, we are doing facsimiles of the file system where we're not
Yeah.
actually interact with the file system already. And so the idea that like there can be a layer on top of that that just slots nicely into the tools we're actually using to interact with our file system, it seems really reasonable and natural for that to happen. So I'm like,
Yeah.
I feel like that could happen. You know, it could be
Yeah.
a layer or a plugin or whatever else, and it just works seamlessly in.
Yeah. It would be cool. Yeah. Even if it was just like, essentially like fake symlinks,
Yeah,
right? Could be
yeah,
the
truly.
first, right? It's just like, this is a symlink, but only from a code navigation perspective, right? It shows up in
Mm-hmm.
both places, but it actually isn't in both places. Honestly, I don't know if I would actually use that.
Yeah,
Um, I think it would have to be, to shift paradigms, you really need to, you can't just be a little bit better, right?
yeah,
It has to be better enough to be worth the pain.
yeah.
So,
And
uh,
the learning cost, the onboarding cost to everybody else in the
yeah,
project when they try to learn it too.
I'm not going to solve this problem, but maybe someone will.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
I
we
think there's a
dreamed.
lot of interesting space there.
Yeah.
Um, I do know that, what's his name? There is one other, um, there is one other project that is, I can't remember what it's called. PHP something or PXP. Have you seen
Is that another one of
PXP?
those layers on top of it?
Yeah,
I'm not
that
sure.
that is still having some active development. It's God, I feel bad that I'm totally spacing out on the details, but I know
It's
it's
written in Rust.
uh one of those projects that's like, one person is working on very slowly, but I know that he's
Is
still
that Ryan Chandler's one?
yes, that is Ryan
Okay.
Chandler's. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I know he has a bunch of different things in the fire, and they're all kind of
Yes.
moving at different paces. But I
Yeah.
see him talking about it from time to time, and it seems like he's like, actively sort of moving the idea in a good direction. So I'm excited to see that because um, I think that the way that he's approaching is interesting. It's like, let's get some just simple practical wins and like prove the concept and then see where it goes from there.
Okay. I'll take
Um,
a look at this. I knew vaguely that he was working on something, but I'd heard of it years ago. So I thought it was not happening. But his last update on the actual repo is days ago. So
yeah,
he's clearly
yeah,
still going.
yeah, yeah. I'm
Okay.
curious to see where it goes because I definitely think there's a lot of interesting stuff still to be done with the language.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, do you did you end up getting deep into like how tlint works, or have you been like just sort of
No.
make it do this and I don't need to understand how it does it?
Yeah. I remember we talked a little bit about like the AST versus regex and blah, blah, blah. And I believe they ended up going the direction of regex in the end because there were not any very good structured ways to look at blade and some of the things that I wanted there.
Mm,
So they're like, if we want to deal with PHP, we might be able to just write these as custom rules with a PHP CS. But because you want some blade things and some things where we don't have the ability to kind of like build a syntax tree from it, we're just going to do regex. So I'm not sure, but I kind of think tlint is all just regex. I mean, I don't
interesting.
know what you ended up using.
It's using like the Microsoft parser. Yeah, it's parsing into an AST.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, don't take what I just said, take it with several grains of salt because I definitely was just like, just make it work.
sure.
I wrote Duster. So Duster I'm intimately familiar with, but Duster is just a collection of other things. It's not like a core level tool.
Hmm.
Tlint is actually a core level tool. And in my mind, I think it's, I said that and now I'm not sure.
I actually It's been a while, but I do kind of think that the code that I contributed was working on an AST. So I think
Yeah,
if it's doing regular expressions, maybe it's doing both for
I
different
am,
use
and
cases.
the reason I thought I was using regular expressions is because the PHP Stan guy was asking recently about anybody who has anything working with Blade, and I said tlint. And he's like, yeah, tlint's just regex. I was like, okay, tlint's just
Mm.
regex. But I remember writing code in tlint that is using like node traverser and all these other things that are very clearly not regex. So
Right.
I don't know if he's saying either he might have misunderstood, or maybe he's saying that just the Blade parts are just regex, because I'm literally looking at a base linter right now, and it is like I'm remembering it is traversing up and down nodes. This is not just regex. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think and this is another one where it's been a couple years now, so I don't know for sure. But I think that um the distinction between tlint and laralint is I wanted laralint to only traverse the tree once. Um which makes a lot of problems way harder to solve. And honestly, I regret that decision sometimes. Every time I have to like implement a new thing, I'm like, why did I do it this way?
well, if you ever want to
Um,
merge it with tlint, I won't complain in any way, shape, or form. I
yeah,
don't
there you
expect it to
go.
be valuable, but just so you know,
I thought about it. I thought about it. Um, but that's a whole. I mean, I was just talking about this. The AST stuff is so fascinating to me. Like the the fact that in PHP you can parse PHP into a tree that you can manipulate is like very cool.
Mhm.
Um, and I recently implemented this linear API or linear SDK,
Mhm.
um, where it's literally taking the linear GraphQL document, right? The definition of the linear GraphQL API, parsing it into a GraphQL AST, and
Okay.
then traversing that tree and node by node converting each element to a PHP tree and then spitting out PHP on the other end.
Interesting.
It's the
Interesting.
wildest thing I've ever seen in my life. It's
Hmm.
like one of those things that I want to talk with everyone about, but like nobody nobody is thinking about abstract syntax trees, let alone like crossing multiple
I
languages
can't.
through these abstract
I'm mad that you
concepts.
brought this up at the end of the podcast when I don't have enough time to pick your brain about this, because I'm now gonna have to pick your brain later when we're not on a podcast, because I want to learn all about that. So
it's
interesting.
it's been a really fun. Yeah, I want to. I don't know. It's one of those things where I wish I could sit down and put together a video or a blog post or something that like explains how it works. But it feels like it would
It's very
take
kind of
it would take hours and hours and hours to put together a 10-minute thing
yeah,
that like explains it well.
yeah,
And that's partially me, like, um, and partially the concept. But one of these days, I've been thinking
yeah,
about it.
yeah. Well, I just side note, I pulled up tlint, and what it turns out is the PHP is all doing the syntax tree. The Blade is all regex, and literally
Okay,
it still is in the same syntax tree, but it just says, "Give me the lines that I care about," and then it regexes over each of those. So that's kind
there
of the point there. So
there is a new project, I say new, it's not that new. Um, and I'm blanking out on his name as well. I'm terrible with names if you can't tell. I talked about it. We talked about it briefly when Taylor was on the show, but someone wrote a formal blade parser in PHP
okay.
that parses blade into a tree, um, and lets you manipulate the tree. And I think that's really interesting because I think that Blade is another place where there's a huge opportunity for the next level of Blade as a language. I
Hmm.
think that I think Livewire has proven that like there's something that like PHP level templating can be more. And I
Yeah,
think that like the modern Blade syntax has is just so much better, the XML style syntax. Um And I really hope that there's like more experimentation in that space. Um, because and something like this maybe would enable it if we had like
Yeah.
a Blade as like sort of a quote unquote proper language
Hmm.
that was sort of first party supported,
Yeah.
being
I
able
like
to
that. I mean,
implement sort of like formal extensions on top of it or like experiment with the language, I think would be really interesting.
yeah, and like I mentioned to you earlier, I read poems in college, so I wrote poems as well. So I'm whenever it gets to this kind of really nitty gritty stuff, that's where I'm like, I'm so grateful there are people in this world who kind of can do that kind of stuff. Because what I will do is when you do it, I will build some really great stuff on top of it. But I am not the person for that. So
Sure.
yeah, we got to
Yeah.
find that person and see. Because I mean, the closest I've come to anything like that, other than tlint, is when I was trying to figure out how to do prettier and tailwind class sorting. And
Hmm.
but again, I believe that's also just regex. It's also just building on top of prettier's native thing. So and it's
Right.
also in JavaScript. So either way, it doesn't help us. So very curious to hear
Right.
about that.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, it's tricky because I think the only way that it could really happen at the language level is if Laravel adopted something like that, because Blade is essentially just a big regular expression, right? Or Blade components are just a regular expression.
Yeah,
Um, and that's great. It works great, right? But it limits what you can do with them. But
yeah,
at the same time, like I don't blame Taylor for not wanting to take on like you know take something that's 15 files and turn it into 200 or
yeah,
500 or whatever it would take,
yeah,
like that's a huge maintenance burden.
yeah, 100.
So
percent
I don't know what'll happen there, but I think there's something interesting there too.
To be over engineered in the future.
To be over engineered in the future. All right. Well, we are coming up on the end here. Is there anything that you would like to particularly plug before we call it?
I mean, if you are really interested in getting your stuff set to a standard, check out Duster. It's just Titan. If you just look up Duster or github.com/Titan/Duster, I'm very curious to get more people using it. I get really excited about things, and by the time they're built, I'm excited about something else, because I'm ADHD. So try it out. If you're looking for like an all-inclusive one that's going to do your PHP CS, your PHP CS fixer, your basically like your code styles the whole way across, try it out and let me know what you think. Just because like the more I get people using it, the more I get motivated to then go spend more time and energy on it. So
Sure.
the closest plug I have to the actual top of this episode is to check out Duster and let me know what you think.
Well, I will allow plugs that aren't related to the topic as well. If there's anything else that you are particularly
Uh,
excited about or think is
Honestly,
interesting that's going
the
on right
things
now.
I'm most excited about right now are the things I'm teaching. I'm excited about the course or the talk I gave at Laravel Live UK was unrecorded. And it was how to build a productive Laravel development team. And man, I cannot wait for a chance to give that somewhere else. Like I'm
Mm,
literally possibly about to just give it on YouTube. It was so well received. And my talks usually like get great feedback. I'm very grateful for that. But like this was the next level. And I was like, oh, this is an untapped interest that people have. And
there's
I'm like, this is
something
what I
here.
do every day.
Yeah.
So I thought, but I don't have anything to plug there yet. So keep an eye out. I'm going to be creating more stuff around that. And then I've got a course that's about to announce, but I can't announce it yet. It's just like everything's in just kind of just hanging. In 2 weeks I'll have a whole bunch of stuff to talk about, but right now, nothing.
All right.
I'm
Well,
still on Twitter. Everybody else is giving up on Twitter. I'm still on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. So just check
yeah.
out the Twitter a couple weeks from now and just see what I got for you.
Yeah, there you go. Right. Well, you and I we were on a little bit on the campaign to get Mastodon happening, and then
We were.
it's so tough. I
It's
mean,
rough, man.
I
Yeah.
I I find I don't know. Is this your experience as well that like in the last 2 weeks Twitter has gotten worse? Is that
I've noticed people complaining that it's gotten worse in the last 2 weeks. A whole bunch of people I know have been like, Twitter's turned to shit in the last couple of weeks. And I have not experienced that other than,
interesting?
this one guy being a jerk that kind of kicked off this conversation a little bit. But I also I only follow a very small number of people. I turn off retweets for a bunch of them and I never go to the For You page. So for my,
Hmm.
my experience of Twitter is so much different than other folks because I'm not once getting recommended anything. I'm not looking at any, whatever. It's just literally if one of my friends didn't tweet it or retweet it, I don't see it. So
Yeah.
for me, Twitter's the same because these are the people I've found over the last 15 years or whatever of using Twitter, and finding that even there's some people I like in person, I don't like you on Twitter. So my list is good,
Mm-hmm.
but I've heard a lot of people say it's gotten worse.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm mostly the same. I'm very careful about my mute and block lists and who I'm following, but I used to find that I would tab over to For You every once in a while because it's like, oh, some interesting thing that I missed gets surfaced up there.
Sure. Yeah.
And now I go over and it's just like all, engagement bait and just stuff that's like, why on earth would any algorithm think that this is interesting to me? Like
Yeah.
just at a really new level. Like it just feels like something got tweaked there that has made that whole piece of it, which is like, that's kind of the upside of Twitter over Mastodon, is that like there is some algorithmic stuff happening that like can help surface interesting things that you wouldn't see otherwise.
Yeah.
Anyway, I feel like I talk about Mastodon at the end of every episode, and we'll keep, it's the Mastodon is my HVAC
White
for
whale.
for
Oh,
Aaron,
yeah. Got it.
right?
Got it. Yeah.
We need to think it's Friday. I have to remember we have to prod him on Sunday about HVAC stuff so that on Monday they talk about it again. I'm going to see how many
We're going to
weeks
put our
we
forces together
Yeah.
to get him talking. I love it.
All right. Well, this has been really fun.
I had a great time.
We'll have to come back and talk about ASTs sometime.
Clearly, that alone, and then also, well, no, that one is ASTs. The example you gave. So yes, ASTs, all the ASTs. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, man.